How can a seemingly modern and prosperous country suddenly plunge into a revolution that utterly transforms its political system? Throughout the 1970s, Iran often projected an image of a nation confidently striding toward the future. With its burgeoning modern cities, vast oil wealth, and increasing international influence, it appeared that Iran was rapidly evolving into a formidable regional power. Yet, beneath this glossy veneer of progress, a profound and pervasive wave of discontent was quietly beginning to swell. Mass protests, severe state repression, an economy teetering on the brink of crisis, and the powerful, resonant voice of a religious leader speaking from exile would ultimately coalesce to ignite one of the 20th century's most dramatic and far-reaching revolutions. This is the compelling narrative of how Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini strategically managed to orchestrate the overthrow of the ancient Iranian monarchy and fundamentally transform Iran into an Islamic republic. But before we delve deeper into this incredible story, please make sure to subscribe to the Past Chronicle. After that, we'd love for you to leave a comment below and tell us what other fascinating historical topics you'd like us to explore. All right, let's journey back into Iran's past. Imagine yourself strolling through the bustling avenues of Tehran in the 1970s. You'd find cafes brimming with lively conversations, movie theaters proudly showcasing Western films, universities undergoing significant expansion, and a city striving vigorously to present itself as a vibrant, modern capital of the Middle East. During those years, Iran genuinely seemed to be navigating a path toward a future that deftly blended deep-rooted tradition with ambitious modernity. Under the firm rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the country was experiencing an era of extraordinarily rapid transformation. Oil revenues were generating unprecedented wealth, and the government was committed to leveraging this prosperity to elevate Iran into a regional superpower, strategically aligned with Western nations. The major cities, in particular, vividly mirrored this sweeping change. In places like Tehran, it was a common sight to see women pursuing higher education at universities, excelling in professional careers, and actively engaging in public life. The streets themselves presented a fascinating mosaic of traditional customs interwoven with modern trends arriving from Europe and the United States. For many foreign observers at the time, Iran genuinely seemed to be a nation confidently shedding its past and stepping decisively onto the global stage of modernity. But appearances, as often proves true, can be profoundly deceiving. While the bustling capitals proudly showcased their newfound prosperity, the reality in many rural areas remained starkly different. The immense oil wealth, which funded so much of the government's ambitions, was not distributed equally across society. Large sectors of the population continued to grapple with difficult, often impoverished living conditions. The chasm between the government-driven modernization initiatives and the daily realities faced by millions of ordinary Iranians was rapidly beginning to widen. Simultaneously, the Shah's regime maintained an iron grip, tolerating absolutely no political opposition. Criticism of the government was meticulously monitored, and those who dared to challenge the authorities faced severe consequences, including arrests, grueling interrogations, or even forced disappearances. The state's formidable security apparatus kept a vigilant watch over students, intellectuals, and religious leaders who voiced even the slightest questioning of government policies. This profound contradiction lay at the very heart of Iran during that turbulent era. On one hand, the country projected a carefully curated image of progress, rapid modernization, and robust economic growth. On the other, power was becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of the monarch, while virtually all critical voices were systematically silenced. For a significant segment of Iranians, the ambitious modernization project felt as though it was moving far too quickly and, more critically, too far away from their deeply cherished cultural and religious traditions. In the vibrant streets, the bustling bazaars, the hallowed mosques, and on university campuses, increasingly uncomfortable and urgent questions began to emerge from the populace. Who was truly making the decisions about the country's future? Was Iran genuinely transforming into a modern, independent nation, or was it merely a kingdom propped up by its oil reserves, military might, and the unwavering support of foreign powers? While the Shah clinked glasses with Western leaders and grandly spoke of the country's bright future, a silent yet potent storm was quietly beginning to brew within the very heart of Iranian society. a storm that would soon discover a powerful voice, capable of channeling widespread discontent into a full-fledged revolution. And that voice, remarkably, was thousands of miles away. In the early 1960s, the government of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi made a pivotal decision to dramatically accelerate Iran's national transformation. The monarch was firmly convinced that the country needed to modernize with unprecedented speed if it were to become a strong, competitive power capable of standing alongside the world's most developed nations. To achieve this ambitious goal, he launched a sweeping program of reforms that would famously become known as the White Revolution. The name itself sounded promising, designed to convey a message of peaceful evolution. It was not a bloody revolution, the government assured its people, but rather a serene transformation intended to usher in prosperity, expanded education, and comprehensive progress for the entire country. The multifaceted plan encompassed extensive land reforms, a significant expansion of the educational system, broadened rights and opportunities for women, and ambitious, large-scale industrialization projects. In theory, every aspect of these reforms appeared to be a decisive step toward a brighter future. The land reform, for example, aimed to dismantle the traditional power of large landowners and redistribute agricultural land to the working peasantry. New schools were rapidly constructed in rural areas, and literacy programs were vigorously promoted to uplift the masses. The government also actively encouraged social changes designed to increase female participation in various aspects of public life. For many urban sectors, these reforms represented a historic opportunity, envisioning an Iran that could genuinely evolve into a modern country with a diversified economy and a more open, inclusive society. But history, as we know, rarely unfolds in such a straightforward manner. While the government enthusiastically celebrated the heralded achievements of the White Revolution, other significant segments of society began to perceive these reforms in a profoundly different, often negative light. For many influential religious leaders, conservative intellectuals, and traditional communities, the changes were far more than mere economic or social adjustments. They represented a direct and existential threat to the country's cherished cultural and religious identity. The Shah's reforms, in their eyes, seemed undeniably inspired by Western models and values. New laws, new societal values, and new customs began to permeate the everyday life of the cities, increasingly challenging long-held traditions. For many deeply religious Iranians, this was not progress at all. It was a perceived form of forced westernization. Resentment began to grow steadily, particularly within the powerful Shiite clergy, who watched with growing alarm as the government expanded its power while simultaneously diminishing the traditional influence of religious authorities. Inside the mosques, sermons began to adopt a distinctly different, more critical tone. Religious leaders warned their congregations that the country was in danger of losing its very soul. They openly denounced the government for drifting dangerously away from Islamic principles and aligning itself far too closely with Western powers. For them, the White Revolution was not a genuine social reform. It was, in fact, a cultural revolution that threatened the fundamental spiritual foundations of the nation. The conflict between ambitious modernization and deeply ingrained tradition was rapidly deepening. While the Shah's opulent palace spoke optimistically of progress, in countless corners of the country, an increasingly troubling question began to emerge. Who truly possessed the legitimate right to determine Iran's ultimate direction? That profound debate would soon find one of its most radical and outspoken critics, a Shiite cleric who would openly condemn the regime and, as a consequence, would eventually be expelled from the country. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, and although he was about to be sent into a period of prolonged exile, his monumental influence over Iran's destiny was only just beginning. When the name Ruhollah Khomeini first began to resonate loudly across Iran, he was neither a politician nor a military leader, nor a revolutionary in the conventional sense of the word. He was, at his core, a revered Shiite cleric, but his words carried an undeniable power that the Shah's sophisticated regime proved utterly incapable of controlling. They resonated with an extraordinary depth within the religious and cultural consciousness of millions of Iranians, stirring emotions and convictions that had long been suppressed. Khomeini had emerged as one of the fiercest and most articulate critics of the White Revolution. From the revered religious pulpits, He vehemently denounced the government's reforms as not merely transforming the country's economic landscape but, more alarmingly, systematically destroying its spiritual roots. For him, the escalating problem was not simply political. It was fundamentally moral, cultural, and profoundly religious. His speeches became progressively harsher and more uncompromising. He accused the government of subjecting Iran to undue foreign influence, particularly that of the United States, which he viewed as an imperialistic force. He relentlessly exposed what he saw as rampant corruption within the regime and issued stark warnings that the modernization efforts promoted by the Shah were dangerously pushing the country away from the sacred principles of Islam. The government reacted swiftly and decisively. Rather than allowing his influence to further proliferate within the country's borders, it opted for a more drastic measure: to expel him. Khomeini was promptly arrested and subsequently sent into exile. He initially spent time in Turkey, later establishing himself in Iraq, and then, years afterward, ultimately resided in France. For the embattled regime, this decision seemed perfectly logical at the time. Removing the charismatic religious leader from the country was expected to significantly weaken his burgeoning influence and, crucially, to calm the escalating political atmosphere. However, the exact opposite occurred. From his vantage point abroad, Khomeini discovered an unexpected yet incredibly powerful tool to widely disseminate his message: cassette recordings. His impassioned sermons began to be recorded and then circulated clandestinely, hand to hand, throughout every corner of Iran. In mosques, bustling bazaars, university campuses, and private homes, people eagerly listened to these illicit tapes that quietly, yet effectively, crossed national borders. It was a communication system that proved almost impossible for the government to fully monitor or control. Each recording powerfully amplified his message, reaching an ever wider audience. In his compelling speeches, he spoke eloquently about justice, fearlessly denounced the regime's brutal repression, and passionately defended the core idea that Islam should occupy the absolute center of the country's political and social life. Little by little, his figure began to transform into something far more than just a religious leader. He was steadily becoming the potent symbol of a viable alternative to the Shah's increasingly unpopular and authoritarian rule. While the government desperately tried to maintain an outward image of stability and control, those clandestine tapes continued to pass from hand to hand, their contents sowing the seeds of discontent. Each copy carried a powerful message that further fueled the deep frustration of an increasingly dissatisfied society. Khomeini's voice effortlessly crossed mountains, cities, and vast deserts without his needing to physically return to the country's soil. And while his words spread like wildfire throughout Iran, the regime still mistakenly believed that the real and immediate danger was contained solely within its borders. They utterly failed to imagine that the revolution that was rapidly approaching had already begun to organize itself and gather unstoppable momentum from exile. By the late 1970s, the atmosphere in Iran was no longer merely tense. It had become utterly explosive. For years, a pervasive sense of discontent had been slowly but steadily simmering among various sectors of society. But now, those disparate tensions were beginning to converge, coalescing into something far larger and more unified. University students, traditional bazaar merchants, urban factory workers, the poorer segments of society, and influential religious leaders were all starting to share the same profound feeling. The Shah's regime no longer genuinely represented the will or the interests of the country. The protests initially began in a scattered, uncoordinated manner. At first, they manifested as relatively small demonstrations concentrated primarily within universities or in specific neighborhoods of the major cities. Students vociferously demanded greater political freedom and more open discourse. Merchants loudly denounced the growing, heavy-handed intervention of the state in the economy, which they felt stifled their businesses. And many religious leaders critically lambasted what they perceived as a dangerous erosion of Islamic values in public life. Individually, each of these groups had distinct and specific demands, but together, their collective grievances were forming something far more powerful and unified: a burgeoning national opposition movement. The Shah's government reacted in the only way it truly knew how, with unwavering control and brutal repression. The regime's greatly feared secret police, infamously known as SAVAK, intensified its surveillance over the entire population. For years, this clandestine organization had meticulously constructed a vast and insidious network of informants, infiltrating universities, labor unions, newspapers, and political circles. Its reputation was truly terrifying, whispered about in hushed tones. People spoke of violent interrogations, forced disappearances, and systematic torture as commonplace tactics. For many Iranians, Savak represented the darkest and most oppressive face of the regime. However, this relentless repression began to produce an effect precisely opposite to what the government had intended. Every arrest, every suppressed demonstration, every credible report of state violence only served to fuel public anger even further, turning frustration into burning rage. The marches began to grow exponentially. What had once been a few hundred people soon swelled into thousands, then tens of thousands. The country's major cities began to experience increasingly large, frequent, and disruptive protests. In some striking cases, these massive demonstrations managed to completely paralyze entire neighborhoods, bringing daily life to a standstill. The slogans chanted by the protesters also began to undergo a significant transformation. At first, many protesters primarily demanded political reforms, hoping for a more open and less authoritarian system within the existing framework. But as the months relentlessly passed, the tone and demands of the protests began to radicalize dramatically. More and more people were no longer simply asking for minor changes within the system. They were now unequivocally demanding the outright end of the regime itself. Meanwhile, from his exile abroad, Khomeini's influence continued to grow in power and scope. His messages circulated more forcefully than ever, feeding the widespread idea that the true solution for Iran was not to reform the monarchy but to replace it completely with a new, Islamic system. For the Shah's government, the rapidly deteriorating situation was becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to control. The country seemed to be spiraling into a dangerous, self-perpetuating cycle. Protests leading to repression, which in turn ignited even more protests. And in the middle of that accelerating spiral of rising tension, a cataclysmic event was about to occur that would forever alter the course of the revolution. A day that would be indelibly etched into the country's collective memory. A day that millions of Iranians would forever remember as Black Friday. The morning of that fateful day began with an unsettling, strange feeling lingering in the air. In Tehran, thousands upon thousands of people began to converge, walking purposefully toward one of the city's most significant squares. Men, women, students, merchants, and even entire families made their way to the same destination. Many carried banners emblazoned with slogans. Others simply walked in solemn silence. Some repeated familiar chants that had already become commonplace in the streets. Independence, freedom, Islamic Republic. The country had been living under a climate of constant, simmering protests for months. But this particular demonstration felt profoundly different, imbued with a palpable sense of impending crisis. The tension was undeniable and thick in the atmosphere. Martial law had been declared just the night before, a stark warning. The Shah's government had officially banned any and all public gatherings, and the armed forces were deployed in intimidating numbers across different parts of the city. Tanks ominously blocked nearby streets. Soldiers, heavily armed and stern-faced, watched the main avenues with unyielding resolve. Helicopters flew low and menacingly over central Tehran, their rotors beating a grim rhythm. Even so, the determined crowd did not halt their advance. People continued to pour into the square, seemingly convinced that the demonstration, despite the grave risks, simply had to take place. Many of those present had listened intently to Khomeini's sermons, which circulated clandestinely across the nation. For them, that day was not just another protest. It was a powerful, collective demonstration of defiance against an oppressive regime. During the initial hours, the demonstration remained relatively calm, a tense standoff. Protesters shouted their slogans and waved their banners with a mixture of hope and fear. Some quietly prayed, seeking solace and strength. Others simply observed the overwhelming military presence that completely surrounded the square, a silent warning. But this fragile calm was destined to be short-lived. The troops eventually received explicit orders to disperse the growing crowd. Soldiers, through megaphones, sternly demanded that the protesters vacate the area immediately. However, a large and determined portion of the crowd chose to remain, refusing to yield their ground. The tension reached its agonizing peak around midday. Suddenly, the deafening sound of gunfire shattered the fragile silence, echoing through the square with terrifying finality. The military forces opened fire without warning. Chaos erupted instantly, a terrifying, uncontrolled frenzy. People began running wildly in every conceivable direction, desperate to escape the hail of bullets. Some instinctively took shelter behind vehicles or nearby buildings, seeking any available cover. Others bravely rushed to help those who had fallen wounded on the blood-soaked ground. The entire scene dissolved into utter pandemonium. Screams of terror, the relentless crackle of gunfire, acrid smoke, and widespread panic filled the square. Within mere minutes, what had begun as a determined demonstration tragically devolved into a devastating massacre. The ground was left horrifically covered in blood. That day would forever go down in history as Black Friday. The exact number of victims was never completely and transparently clear. Some sources tragically spoke of dozens of deaths, while others, more grimly, mentioned much higher numbers, potentially in the hundreds. But beyond the precise casualty count, the immediate impact was profound and irreversible. The government desperately tried to justify the brutal repression, disingenuously claiming that some protesters were armed and thus posed a direct threat to public security. However, many survivors vehemently insisted that the vast majority of the people present were completely unarmed, engaged in peaceful protest. For millions of Iranians, what transpired in that square fundamentally changed everything. The Shah's regime was no longer merely seen as an authoritarian government. For many, it had become a tyrannical power willing to fire upon its own people, indiscriminately killing them. Far from halting the escalating protests, the tragedy of Black Friday produced the exact opposite effect. It fueled the revolution even further, injecting it with renewed ferocity. In the days and weeks that immediately followed, demonstrations multiplied exponentially across the entire country. Anger, collective grief, and righteous outrage became the potent fuel for a movement that now seemed to have no way back, no possibility of retreat. Iran had irrevocably crossed a point of no return. And now, the pressing question was no longer whether the Shah's regime would survive. The real, agonizing question was how much longer it could possibly endure. After Black Friday, something fundamentally and permanently shifted in Iran. Government violence, rather than successfully suppressing the revolution, ironically served to accelerate its momentum. What had once been isolated protests began to coalesce and transform into a truly national movement, powerful enough to paralyze the entire country. The streets were no longer the sole battleground of the conflict. Now, the struggle was also being waged in factories, within universities, in public offices, and, most crucially, at the very heart of Iran's economy, the vital oil industry. Iran, at that time, was one of the world's largest oil producers. For decades, that immense wealth had generously financed the Shah's ambitious modernization projects. Oil was undeniably the country's economic engine, the indispensable foundation of its political power. But that powerful engine was about to grind to a halt. Oil workers, a critical segment of the labor force, began to actively join the burgeoning protest movement. At first, there were small, localized labor interruptions, then partial strikes, and finally a massive, coordinated shutdown that severely impacted much of the energy sector. Refineries began dramatically reducing their production. Ports, once bustling with activity, ceased exporting oil at their previous rapid pace. The vital flow of money that sustained the government began to shrink drastically, threatening its very existence. For any modern state, an economic crisis can be dangerous. But for a regime already facing massive, unrelenting protests in the streets, the situation was rapidly becoming critical, teetering on the brink of collapse. The dire consequences began to be felt almost immediately across the nation. The government found itself with fewer and fewer resources to keep the country functioning effectively. Some essential services began to be severely affected or even halted. The The supply of basic goods, crucial for daily life, started to become irregular and unreliable. Economic uncertainty, a corrosive force, rapidly spread through the cities, creating widespread anxiety. At the same time, the regime's formidable repressive machinery, which had for so long maintained order through fear, began to show unmistakable signs of exhaustion and crumbling efficacy. The secret police, SAVAK, which for years had maintained an iron grip through pervasive surveillance and intimidation, could no longer contain the sheer volume and widespread nature of the protests erupting across the country. Demonstrations were multiplying at a pace far exceeding the security forces' ability to suppress them. Even within the armed forces, traditionally a pillar of the Shah's power, signs of internal division began to appear. Some soldiers and officers were starting to openly question whether they should continue repressing a population that was growing larger, more determined, and increasingly defiant every single day. The once seemingly solid regime, which had appeared unshakable just a few years earlier, was now beginning to show visible and alarming cracks. Meanwhile, from his distant exile, Khomeini's influence continued to grow, becoming more potent and pervasive than ever. His messages, amplified by clandestine cassette tapes, circulated throughout Iran with renewed strength. For millions of people, the exiled cleric was no longer just a respected religious leader. He was rapidly transforming into the figure who represented the last hope for a new political system, a system that promised to decisively break with the oppressive past. By the end of that turbulent year, the Shah's government was extremely fragile, hanging by a thread. The entire country was paralyzed by widespread strikes. The economy was weakening rapidly, entering a dangerous recession, and even crucial international political support, once unwavering, was beginning to grow uncertain and waver. For the very first time in decades, the immense power of the Iranian monarchy seemed truly and existentially threatened. And very soon, the Shah himself would be forced to make a momentous decision that would forever change the history of his country. A decision that would definitively mark the beginning of the end of his long and once absolute reign. At the dawn of the new year, Iran was no longer the same country. Protests continued to rage in the streets with unyielding fervor. Strikes paralyzed key sectors of the economy, bringing vital industries to a standstill, and the government seemed increasingly unable to regain any semblance of control. For decades, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled with a potent combination of military power, vast oil wealth, and strong international support. But now, those once unshakable pillars were beginning to collapse one by one, sending shockwaves through the nation. The political atmosphere was utterly chaotic, a maelstrom of dissent. Demonstrations gathered ever larger and more defiant crowds. In many cities, portraits of the Shah were defiantly removed from public buildings or even burned in the streets, a symbolic act of rejection. Anti-monarchy slogans, once unthinkable, were now openly heard echoing in universities, bustling markets, and working-class neighborhoods, signaling a profound shift in public sentiment. The regime's authority, once absolute, was visibly disappearing before everyone's eyes, evaporating into thin air. Meanwhile, inside the beleaguered government, making critical decisions was becoming increasingly difficult, bordering on impossible. Some advisors advocated for even harsher repression, believing that only brute force could crush the protests. Others adamantly insisted on the urgent need for deep political reforms to placate the enraged population. But with each passing day, the monarch's room for maneuver shrank dramatically, leaving him with fewer and fewer viable options. International support, once a cornerstone of his power, was also beginning to weaken perceptibly. For years, the United States government had considered Iran a strategic and indispensable ally in the geopolitically vital region. However, the country's growing instability and widespread unrest caused deep concern among Western governments, who were no longer certain how much longer the beleaguered regime could possibly survive. In that desperate and rapidly deteriorating context, the Shah made a dramatic and fateful decision. He announced that he would leave the country. The news spread like wildfire throughout Iran, igniting both joy and apprehension. Officially, the monarch maintained that he needed to leave temporarily to receive urgent medical treatment abroad. But for millions of Iranians, it was glaringly obvious that it was more than just a temporary trip. It was, unmistakably, the definitive end of an era. On the day of his departure, the Shah arrived at Tehran's airport, accompanied by his family, his face etched with strain and resignation. Images from that day reveal a visibly exhausted man, acutely aware that he was leaving behind a country he could no longer effectively govern or control. The plane eventually took off, soaring into the sky. With that momentous flight, the chapter of more than 2,000 years of monarchy in Persia, a venerable tradition that had remarkably survived empires, invasions, and countless revolutions, finally came to a definitive close. But the Shah's departure, while symbolically powerful, did not immediately resolve the country's turbulent future. Before leaving, he had appointed a moderate prime minister, Shapur Bakhshar, desperately hoping to form a provisional government capable of restoring order and implementing much-needed democratic reforms. However, the new government immediately faced a fundamental and insurmountable problem. Much of the population no longer trusted the existing system whatsoever. For millions of Iranians, the monarchy had irrevocably lost all legitimacy and moral authority. The protests were not simply aiming to replace one leader with another. They were demanding something far deeper and more revolutionary, a complete and total transformation of the entire political system. As the Shah's plane disappeared into the vast sky, the country stood at an incredibly decisive and perilous moment. The old regime had finally fallen, but the new one had not yet been born, leaving a dangerous power vacuum. And in that volatile vacuum of power, a figure who had spent years in exile was about to make his triumphant return to Iran. A return that would, without question, change the country's history forever. Today, decades after those seismic events, the Islamic Revolution remains one of the most profoundly influential and widely studied events of the 20th century. This is because it was not merely a political revolution. It was a deep and transformative upheaval that fundamentally altered the very identity of a nation, and whose far-reaching consequences continue to echo powerfully to this day. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoyed this video and are passionate about this kind of in-depth historical content, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next videos and can continue to discover more fascinating stories with us. See you in the next video.